The Tower of London, a fortress that has seen 1,000 years of blood and betrayal. From its very foundation, the Tower of London was designed to inspire dread. This stronghold, part palace, part prison, still looms on the River Thames as a witness to the darkest chapters in English history. Oh, if walls could talk, what stories they would tell. Those stones have echoed with the cries of prisoners, and even the clash of steel. Well, today we're going to tell the story of the Tower of London from start to finish, all the way from the Norman times up into our modern day. And of course we won't be sparing any of the gritty details. There's plenty of them. So if you'll spend the next hour with me, we can go back to the very early times and trace where the Tower of London began, and by the end we'll have a good understanding. Allow me first to welcome you to the channel. I am your host, and off we are for another English history video. Now I'd like to begin the customary thank you to everyone who keeps this entire channel ad-free, that is those who support on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, who check out the merch store, and also those who leave the occasional donation through Super Thanks and the PayPal link. You have my utmost respect and thanks for that. If you'd like to join that prestigious club, well, the links are in the pinned comment, video, and channel description if you want to go there. Otherwise, just do the usual algorithm boosting things, like, comment, subscribe, click the hype button, and tell your friends about this ad-free sanctuary in our ad-drenched modern age. In any case, let us begin now. The history of the Tower of London. Well, not many buildings can trace their foundations back almost 1,000 years, but the Tower of London is certainly one of them that can. In fact, our tale begins in 1066. If you're familiar with English history, you'll know that that's a rather important date, to say the least. After William the Conqueror defeated the English at Hastings and was crowned king, he set about securing his new realm by force. And nowhere was more important than in turbulent London, which at the time, and still is, England's largest city. William ordered a mighty castle built on the southeast corner of London's old Roman walls. This would become the Tower of London. According to a Norman chronicler, William's men completed certain fortifications in the city against the restlessness of the huge and brutal populace. Apparently they weren't too happy about being conquered by a Norman king, who, by the way, didn't even speak English. Certainly ruffles a few of the locals up. Well, in other words, the tower was raised to overawe and even intimidate the unruly Londoners from any thought of rebellion. And it seemed to have worked. It was a pretty stark symbol of Norman domination looming over a conquered people. And then there was the White Tower, a great square keep. That was the first stone structure. But they didn't begin this right away in 1066. That was begun around 1078. At up to 90 feet tall, and with walls 15 feet thick, it was an engineering marvel, rather, of its day. The English labourers forced to build it must have looked on in quite a bit of despair at the blueprints of that one, and of course, being forced to do this for a foreign conqueror, well, certainly not the best work conditions, I suppose. Hard to keep them motivated. Well, whips notwithstanding, although we don't know if they were using that sort of thing. I'm just commenting. In any case, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle complained that King William, quote, sorely burdened the unhappy people with forced labour on castles. Now, the details of how they forced them to do this are somewhat left out, but I think we can use a little bit of imagination. Now the White Tower was clad in bright can stone from France, giving it a ghostly glow, and that's where it got its name, because the stone was this glowing white. And inside this tower were sumptuous chambers for the king. But below, they left that space open for a dark dungeon. So from the outset, the tower served a kind of dual purpose. A royal stronghold, sure, but also a feared prison. William's successors expanded the complex. In 1097, King William II, that is William Rufus, reinforced the tower with a stone curtain wall, and that replaced the earlier wooden palisades. And to remember that most early castles were wooden. Don't think that everything was stone. That's a bit of a Hollywood misnomer. More towers and defensive walls followed in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that created a concentric fortress. So by the 1200s, the tower had grown into a small fortified city with multiple layers of walls, a moat, and of course the numerous intimidating towers. Kings like Henry III and Edward I poured huge sums of money into strengthening it. They knew that holding the tower was key to controlling the kingdom. And to this day, actually, the general layout of the Tower of London complex remains just as those medieval builders left it. From early on, the tower earned its grim reputation. Of course, you don't build something like that to loom over the locals without, wanting them to feel a kind of dread at it, make them nervous. The first known prisoner was one who was actually the Bishop of Durham, Ranulph Flambard, and quite ironically, he was one of the very men who helped design parts of the White Tower. Bit of a twist of fate, isn't it? In 1100, King Henry I accused Flambard of extortion and locked him in a cell at the top of the tower. Flambard, who was a reportedly wily character, managed the tower's first escape. Kept in relative comfort, he hosted a feast for his guards. He got them drunk on wine, and then he lowered himself by a rope smuggled in a wine cask. Of course, when the jailers awoke, the prisoner had vanished into the night. I'm sure someone would have lost their job over that. And the escape, well, it was so unbelievable that one chronicler half jested the bishop must have used witchcraft to get away. Well, this early escapade established a pattern, too. For the next 900 years, the tower would confine an endless parade of traitors, heretics, princes, and pretenders, some of whom vanished mysteriously. But a lucky few, like Flambard, managed to cheat fate. Probably best that he got his escape attempt in early. They built the prison before they planned out the measures to prevent people from escaping. I don't know, maybe a high window just wasn't enough. So moving on from those early days and into the high Middle Ages, the tower continued to grow both in physical size, but also in its dark reputation. King Richard the Lionheart, the quintessential English king, dug a moat around the castle in the 1190s, and additional outer walls were built. And what's a castle without a moat, right? I want a moat around my house. Well, I live in an apartment, so that's probably not possible. Maybe one day. Well, the tower became not just a fortress and prison, but also a royal residence at times, complete with great halls and a chapel. It's a little bit strange, too, that kings would want to live right on top or next to the prison, but that's just the way it is. Yet even as kings added their domestic comforts, they never forgot the tower's primary role as a powerfully armed garrison in the heart of the capital. In those uneasy times, monarchs took refuge behind its walls, and their foes were often imprisoned inside. One remarkable aspect of the tower in medieval times was its royal menagerie of exotic animals. So believe it or not, medieval kings kept captive wild beasts as symbols of their might, and the tower was kind of like a zoo. As early as the 1200s, Londoners could glimpse at strange creatures behind the tower's walls. In 1235, Henry III received the 3 leopards, likely lions. He got these from the Holy Roman Emperor, and by 1252 he even acquired a great white bear, very probably a polar bear from the King of Norway. So imagine that spectacle, a polar bear in medieval London. The poor thing, though, chained onto the tower grounds. I don't think they would have built it much of a nice enclosure, that's for sure. The sheriffs of London were instructed to buy the bear a long rope and muzzle, and it was regularly led down to the Thames River to swim and catch fish for its supper. Crowds, of course, would gather and marvel at the pale bear from the frozen north. A few years later, in 1255, Henry III accepted an African elephant as a gift from the King of France. A special wooden house was built for the elephant near the tower gates. Of course, people flocked to see that creature too. The first elephant ever in England, which Matthew Barris, a monk and chronicler, dutifully sketched. Now, the poor elephant sadly did not survive long in the tower. It died after a couple of years, likely because its keepers had absolutely no idea how to care for it. One report even claims they tried giving it wine, believing water was bad for elephants. I don't know where they got that idea from, but these royal beasts must have added to the tower's mystique, there's no doubt about that. To common folk, the fortress was not only a place of dread, but also of wonders. Lions prowling in cages, a bear fishing in the Thames, an elephant trumpeting around in its pen. But by 1300, the Tower of London was an imposing concentric castle, upgraded to withstand the latest threats. It bristled with archery towers and stone battlements. Kings stored their treasury and regalia here for safekeeping, the most secure place in the whole country. It was said that whoever controlled the tower controlled the kingdom's riches and capital city. So unsurprisingly, during the civil conflicts that rocked medieval England, the tower was often the prize for both sides, a kind of capture the flag. If you don't have the tower, you don't have anything worthwhile. Yet the fortress was not invincible. In 1381, during the infamous Peasants' Revolt, the tower was breached for the first and only time in its history. But not by a foreign army. No, not by Vikings, not by the French or the Spanish, but by the English. And not an English army, just a mob of angry English commoners. King Richard II, who was only 14 years old, by the way, had taken shelter inside the tower with his mother and advisers as tens of thousands of rebels swarmed London. But why were they so angry? Unfair taxes. All sounds familiar. While Richard went out to parley with the rebel leaders, a horde of peasants stormed through an undefended gate. The garrison, perhaps they were sympathetic or just simply terrified at the numbers of the peasants, offered no resistance. They just let them through. They don't get paid enough for that, I'm sure. Rebels poured into the courtyards, cheering and just making a mess of things. One contemporary chronicler, Jean Froissart, describes how these men made themselves at home in the royal quarters, even lounging on the king's bed and jokingly stroking the beards of the tower guards as if they owned the place. It almost sounds like a medieval January 6th sort of thing. You know, it's kind of like that. But the main targets were hiding inside, the king's ministers, whom they blamed for their misery. Oh, and just quickly, when I say January 6th, I mean the White House in the United States when that happened. I think it was in 2020 that happened, I think so. In any case, the rebels found the Lord Chancellor, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, cowering in the chapel of the White Tower, praying for sanctuary. He did not find any. They dragged him out to Tower Hill. Then they seized Sir Robert Hales, the royal treasurer, as well, and in a frenzy of revolutionary justice, the mob cut off the heads of Sudbury, Hales, and several other royal officials. On that summer day, Tower Hill ran with noble blood. A pretty gruesome scene. According to reports, it took 8 blows of a sword to sever the archbishop's head. The rebels stuck the severed heads on pikes and displayed them atop London Bridge as a warning. Even the tower's formidable walls couldn't prevent that atrocity, and that's a reminder that the tower's power ultimately depended on the loyalty of those within. I'm sure security upgrades were made after that incident. Now, incredibly, King Richard II survived the revolt by bravely confronting the rebels elsewhere and diffusing their anger, at least temporarily. It was certainly a gamble, though, the scene of Richard floating down on that barge while everyone's jeering him. It really could have gone either way. But the events of 1381 certainly became part of the tower's grim legend. Never again would an enemy force the gates open by sheer intimidation. The tower resumed its role as a fortress and prison, but now with a few different kinds of heads decorating the spikes. Well, with that bloody fiasco all done for, during the later Middle Ages, the tower imprisoned a who's who of high-ranking captives, and saw some quietly chilling crimes too. The wars and power struggles of the 15th century often ended for the losers behind the tower's bars. The fortress became a royal dumping ground for overthrown kings and unwanted heirs. And one example is King Henry VI, the pious but unlucky king who was deposed during the Wars of the Roses. In 1471, Henry was held in the Wakefield Tower at the Tower of London after his forces lost a battle. On the night of May 21st, Henry was found dead in his chamber. Now, the official story claimed that he died of melancholy, but no one really believed that. It was widely suspected that he was murdered, likely stabbed or strangled on the orders of the new king, Edward IV. Well, legend has it that Henry was at prayer when his killer struck. And if true, the Holy King's blood was spilled on the tower's stone floor and adding another royal ghost to its ranks. In fact, a lot of people said that Henry's spirit was later rumored to appear in the tower on the anniversary of his death, but it's hard to prove that one. Still hard to prove it otherwise, though. A decade later came the most notorious mystery of all, the fate of the princes in the tower. In 1483, King Edward IV died, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as his heir. The young prince and his 9-year-old brother Richard were lodged in the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection, under the care of their uncle Richard the Duke of Gloucester. But Uncle Richard was, well, he was ambitious, to say the least. So that summer, Richard Gloucester seized power and had himself crowned King Richard III. And the two princes? Well, they just vanished into thin air. They were never seen again. It was whispered that the princes had been quietly murdered inside the tower to eliminate any threat to Richard's rule. Thomas More, writing a few decades later, gave a pretty vivid account, too. He alleged that King Richard hired men to creep into the prince's chamber as they slept and smother them with pillows, and then burying their bodies in a stairwell. The truth will never be known for certain, but bones of 2 children were discovered buried under a tower staircase in 1674 during some renovations. Seems like a smoking gun, right? Those remains, which are likely the poor princes, were eventually interred in Westminster Abbey. The disappearance of the princes in the tower, well, that's perhaps one of the great unsolved crimes. But it seems pretty obvious. I suppose it's a bit too late for a trial now. But it forever cemented the tower's reputation as a sinister place, where innocent blood could be shed in secret. And to this day, the story chills all who hear it. Think about it. A 12-year-old and a 9-year-old, 2 young boys, betrayed and quietly killed by their own uncle, nonetheless. It's pretty horrible. Hard to justify that one, certainly. In any case, by the end of the 1400s, the tower had seen kings, queens, and nobles locked in the cells, and occasionally even killed there. But believe it or not, darker days lay ahead as the tower entered the tumultuous Tudor era, when royal tyranny and religious upheaval turned the tower into a factory of misery. The 16th century, the age of the Tudors, that was when the Tower of London really reached the peak of its infamy as a prison and execution ground. As one chronicler of the time noted, by the reign of Henry VIII, the fortress was used, quote, more as an armory and house of munition, and thereunto a place for the safekeeping of offenders than a palace royal. The Tudor monarchs, Henry VIII, his children Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, all made ample use of the tower to incarcerate their political rivals, and many of them met a dreadful fate, either just outside its gates on Tower Hill, or within the tower precincts itself. Henry VIII in particular, who was doesn't have the best reputation, I'm sure you already know. Well, he turned the tower into a feared place of torment and death. During his volatile reign, dozens of notable figures were imprisoned in the tower on trumped-up charges of treason or heresy. Many paid with their heads, too, and the most famous victims were 2 of Henry's own wives. He had 6 of them in total, by the way. In 1536, Anne Boleyn, Henry's second queen, was arrested on made-up charges of adultery and treason. She was brought by boat through the grim Traitor's Gate into the tower, and there in a cold room she wrote despairingly of her unjust imprisonment. Her final letters are pretty sad. There's a weird resignation to them as well. She's sort of just not begging for her life, just, I guess, lamenting it. Poor Anne. Well, regardless, on the morning of May 19th, 1536, she was led to a scaffold on Tower Green. Within the fortress walls, Henry granted her the mercy of a private execution away from the gawking crowds on Tower Hill. Anne Boleyn showed remarkable composure. She joked with her executioner, and reportedly even gently adjusted her gown so the swordsman would have a clean strike. With one swift swing of a French sword, the executioner severed the Queen's head. Her last words were a prayer for the king. Anne's head and body were buried in an unmarked grave in the nearby chapel of St. Peter and Vincula. Inside the tower, that is. And it is said that on certain nights the ghost of Anne Boleyn walks the tower's corridors, clutching her severed head under one arm. Henry VIII was not done with Anne, I'm afraid. There were a few more. In 1542, he sent his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, to the Tower on charges of infidelity. The teenage Catherine reportedly screamed for mercy as she was dragged away, knowing exactly what she was in for. And she, too, was beheaded on the Tower Green and buried right next to Anne. Another victim was Henry's distant cousin, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who at age 67 resisted Henry's attempts to destroy her family. Imprisoned in the Tower, the elderly lady met a truly horrific end in 1541. The inexperienced headsman actually missed his mark multiple times. One account claims Margaret, dignified to the end, refused to kneel meekly and was chastised by the axeman, who hacked her to death in a gory, botched execution. The brutality of Margaret Pole's death certainly shocked people even in that brutal age. But not all Tower prisoners under Henry were executed. Some endured torture and starvation instead, which is not good, but, you get what you're given, don't you? The Tower's reputation as a torture chamber largely comes from this period, although torture was not as routine as later legend suggests. There's been a little bit of romanticizing about that it was this just 24/7 bloodbath. It wasn't quite like that. In any case, when it comes to torture, it required royal permission, and it was mainly employed in cases of treason or heresy, when the crown wanted information or confessions. Between 1530 and 1550, several prisoners were subjected to agonizing tortures in the Tower's lower regions. Three infamous devices in particular struck fear into the hearts of prisoners. The first was the dreaded rack, that framework that would slowly stretch the victim's body, dislocating joints, tearing muscles. Introduced to the Tower in the late 1400s, the rack earned the nickname the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, after a constable of the Tower who built a particularly vicious version of it. Prisoners who experienced the rack often had limbs rendered useless for life, and that's if they even survived. For example, the Jesuit priest Guy Fawkes, arrested for the gunpowder plot of 1605, was racked in the Tower so severely that when forced to sign a confession, he could barely hold a pen. His signature on that document is a barely recognizable scrawl, a picture that tells 1,000 words. Then there was the Scavenger's Daughter, an ingeniously cruel device invented during Henry VIII's reign, essentially the opposite of the rack. Let me explain. It was more of a metal frame that compressed the body into a suffocating crouch. The victim's head was forced down to their knees and bound tightly. Blood would pool and noses would burst under the pressure. Few could endure this ordeal for long. It was used mainly to extract information quickly to extreme pain. Then there's the manacles and the little ease. Some prisoners were simply chained to the walls or suspended by iron gauntlets, manacles they called them, on their wrists until their shoulders almost tore from the sockets. A tiny closet-like cell known as the Little Ease was another punishment, so small that a prisoner could not stand up. They could neither sit, nor could they lie down fully. It forced them into a perpetual crouch. Prisoners left in Little Ease for days emerged broken and cramped up. Not very comfortable at all. And let's talk about one notable victim of the time, of torture, that is, Anne Askew, a young gentlewoman accused of heresy for her Protestant beliefs under Henry's Catholic-inclined regime in 1546. This was a little bit in earlier times. Well, she is one of the few women on record tortured in the Tower. Anne Askew was stretched on the rack so savagely that she was crippled. When she was taken out to be burned at the stake as a heretic, she had to be carried in a chair, because all of her bones and joints had been pulled apart to the point where she could not walk or even stand. Her story, recorded later in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, illustrates the extremes of cruelty inflicted within the Tower's walls. Under Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, the Tower saw fewer new corpses, but politics soon returned. In 1553, after the young King Edward died, Lady Jane Grey, a teenage girl used as a pawn in a power grab, was locked up in the Tower. She was named Queen, too, but she only lasted 9 days. Jane was deposed by Edward's Catholic sister, Mary Tudor. Now, Mary I, who was also called Bloody Mary, kept Lady Jane locked in the gentleman's jailer's house. Despite Jane's youth and relative innocence, they ultimately ordered her execution to remove any threat. And so on February 1554, the 16-year-old Jane Grey was beheaded within the Tower grounds. The tragic teenager supposedly said, "I pray you will dispatch me quickly," to her executioner, and blindfolded herself before placing her head on the block. There's a very famous painting of that, which is quite sad too, the execution of Lady Jane Grey. Her young husband, Guildford Dudley, was also executed on the same day on Tower Hill. And just like that, another 2 youthful lives added to the tally. Queen Mary I was fiercely Catholic and filled the Tower's cells with Protestant opponents. Ironically, one prisoner was her own half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was sent to the Tower in 1554, accused unjustly of supporting a rebellion. As she arrived by boat under the grim arch of Traitor's Gate, she reportedly murmured, "Here lands as true a subject as ever landed at these stairs." Imprisoned in the bell tower, the princess feared she would never leave alive. She etched a desperate poem on her window and insisted on sleeping on the floor as a sign of her unjust captivity. After 2 tense months, Elizabeth was finally released. You see, Mary dared not execute her sister without proof of treason. It just wouldn't have looked very good. But had things gone a little differently, the Tower might have witnessed the execution of Queen Elizabeth herself. Well, when Elizabeth did become queen in 1558, the tables turned. Oh, how the turntables! During her long reign, the Tower's dungeons filled with Catholic recusants and political plotters against her. Elizabeth's government used the Tower as an interrogation center for conspirators, especially in the 1570s and 80s, when fear of Catholic plots ran high. Many Catholic priests caught secretly ministering were tortured in the Tower before being put to death elsewhere. Put to death. What's Delph? I don't know. Well, one remarkable story is that of John Gerard, a Jesuit priest who was captured in 1597. Now, Gerard was subject to the manacles. Remember, that's suspended by his wrists from a beam for hours at a time. Though enduring excruciating pain, his own account describes bleeding and numb arms, he refused to betray his co-conspirators. Gerard then accomplished a daring escape. He managed to secretly communicate with friends outside by writing in invisible ink, orange juice, that is, on scraps of paper. With help from sympathetic accomplices, he escaped the tower by crawling along a rope slung across the moat one dark night. It was one of the few successful escapes in the tower's history, and it also managed to humiliate Elizabeth's jailers. John Gerard lived to tell the tale in a memoir, recounting the tower's terrors from a survivor's perspective, and I bet that would have been a bestseller. But not everyone was so fortunate. The tower claimed one more under Elizabeth's rule, albeit kind of posthumously. You see, in 1601, the Earl of Essex, once Elizabeth's favourite, later leader of a failed revolt, was beheaded on Tower Green after being held in the tower. A special scaffold was built inside the fortress, as his popularity with the London crowd made a public execution quite risky. And it wasn't just one stroke of the axe required, but 3 rather, to finish him off. The aging Elizabeth thereafter was said to remark grimly on how many heads had fallen on her account, and indeed by 1600 the Tower of London had indelibly become the place of off with his head in the English psyche. And so here we are at the dawn of the enlightened 17th century. But unfortunately, it just brought new dramas. In 1605, under King James I, the tower received a pretty infamous group of inmates. Guy Fawkes and his fellow Gunpowder plot conspirators, who had attempted to blow up the Parliament House, which doesn't win you any friends in the nobility. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Fawkes was tortured on the rack in the tower's dungeon until he revealed the details of the plot. After a few days, he was so weakened that signature looked like a child's scribble. Fawkes and the others were later executed by the grisly method of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Not at the tower, though, but their interrogation and suffering there became part of the tower's feared law. Despite its grim reputation, the tower also was considered a secure haven for crucial assets, and the most crucial of all was the crown jewels, symbols of monarchy. They'd been stored at the tower since medieval times. We should say that during the English Civil War, that's in the 1640s, the original medieval jewels were actually removed and melted down by parliamentarians who sold off or destroyed the regalia after executing Charles I. The crown jewels on display today are replacements made for the restoration in 1661. While the tower's arsenal of weapons was also vast, it was effectively the national armory. When civil war erupted between King Charles I and Parliament in 1642, the tower again became a strategical linchpin. Initially, London citizens and the city militia, who were sympathetic to Parliament rather than the king, seized control of the tower, not letting the king inside. Charles supporters plotted to take it back, and at one point even pointed cannons at the tower's battlements, ready to fire on the city if needed. Well, however, no large-scale battle unfolded at the tower, probably for the best. It remained under Parliament's control throughout the conflict, serving as a prison for royalists. After the war, with Charles I executed and the monarchy abolished, several of the king's leading supporters, and some of the judges who condemned him, were themselves imprisoned in the tower after the tides of fortune shifted. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II saw some vengeful bloodshed linked to the tower. A number of the men who had signed Charles I's death warrants were hunted down, Some, like Sir Thomas Harrison, were locked in the tower before being gruesomely executed, drawn and quartered at Charing Cross. Others were already dead, and in a macabre twist, the new king had their remains exhumed and displayed. Even the skull of Oliver Cromwell was briefly mounted on a spike above the tower's gates as a posthumous punishment. Yet, the Restoration era also brought one of the tower's most legendary capers, providing a rare note of dark humor amid all of the blood and death. Probably needed one after that. This was the escapade of Colonel Thomas Blood in 1671, the man who nearly stole the crown jewels. Now, Colonel Blood himself was an Irish adventurer with a history of audacious schemes. Disguising himself as a clergyman, Blood befriended the elderly jewel house keeper at the tower, one Talbot Edwards. Over several visits, Blood ingratiated himself with the Edward family, even proposing a fake marriage between his nephew and the keeper's daughter. On May 9th, 1671, Blood made his move. He and his accomplices arrived early in the morning, and Edwards obligingly let them into Jewel House to show them the crown jewels. But the moment they were inside, Blood whipped out a hammer and smashed the 77-year-old Edwards over the head, knocking him senseless. In a frenzy, he grabbed the imperial state crown and flattened it with a mallet to hide under his cloak. Another accomplice stuffed the royal orb into his pants. They even sawed off the royal scepter in half because it was too long to carry. Well, the gang tried to dash out of the tower with the loot, but miraculously, the dazed Edwards regained consciousness and raised an alarm, shouting out treason, murder, and Blood and his men were tackled at the gate by guards. Even after he was seized, the brazen Blood refused to speak to anyone except the king. And here the story takes on an even stranger turn. King Charles II was apparently so amused by Blood's sheer audacity that not only did he pardon him, but granted Blood a pension and befriended him at court. Well, didn't see that coming. The keeper, Edwards, who fortunately survived his injuries, was rewarded with a tidy sum for his ordeal, though probably not as much as Blood's annual pension. The crown jewels were recovered, dented up a bit, but intact. And since that day, no one has ever come quite so close to stealing them. The Colonel Blood affair added a rogue's tale to the tower's history, showing that not every tower story is one of solemn tragedy. Some are pretty outrageous, or almost comical. In any case, by the late 1600s, the tower's role as a royal residence had faded entirely. Successive monarchs found its lodgings to be cold and damp compared to the newer places. But its role as an armory, garrison, and prison remained. The Office of Ordnance had its headquarters there, churning out weapons of war. The famous Line of Kings display, a row of wooden horses with medieval king's armor, was set up in the tower as early as 1652, a precursor of the tower as a tourist attraction, maybe. And as gunpowder weaponry in modern prisons evolved, the tower's military importance slowly waned. The 18th century saw fewer political prisoners, but a handful of notable figures still passed through its gates. In 1716, after a failed Jacobite rebellion, the defeated Scottish lords were brought to the tower. The Earl of Derwentwater and others who were held before being publicly beheaded on Tower Hill, among the last executions of nobility by axe in England. The very last of such executions was on Tower Hill in 1747, when an 80-year-old Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, lost his head for leading a Jacobite uprising. An immense crowd actually gathered to watch, and legend says The shock of the beheading caused a scaffold stand to collapse, killing several spectators too. Shouldn't have stood so close, though. In any case, through the 1700s, tourists could visit certain areas of the tower by giving a small tip to the yeoman warders. The tower's dark reputation only grew in popular imagination. Novelists and playwrights spun lurid tales about it. This Gothic fascination with the tower reached new heights in the Victorian era. The Victorians, loving both history and horror, restored parts of the tower to a pseudo-medieval appearance and spread romanticized stories of its past. Writers in the 1800s nicknamed it the Bloody Tower and Traitor's Gate, cementing those ominous labels. But real changes were happening too. The royal menagerie that had delighted and sometimes alarmed visitors for 6 centuries came to an end. By the early 1800s, the collection of animals at the tower, lions, tigers, all sorts, were considered a hazard and somewhat antiquated. Well, in one incident in 1830, a guard was reportedly attacked by a leopard. In another, a lion got loose from its cage. Accounts vary. Some say a soldier was bitten by a monkey, too. The Duke of Wellington, then Constable of the Tower, decided that enough was enough. And in 1835, the menagerie was closed for good. Most of the creatures were transferred to the new London Zoo in Regent's Park. After they departed, the old lion tower and cages were torn down, and no longer would the roars of lions echo through the tower at night, though their ghostly presence lives on in legend, apparently. Meanwhile, parts of the tower that had fallen into disuse were remodeled. The Victorian authorities, keen on preservation, undertook renovations to make the castle look a bit more medieval. They removed some later buildings, uncovered old archways, and rebuilt battlements. The tower was becoming as much a monument and a museum as a military site. The public could tour the Grand Armory's displays of weapons and armor. Guidebooks from the 19th century reveal that visitors were especially interested in the tower's dungeons and the stories of prisoners. The more gruesome, the better. And that's certainly not changed. One ghost story from this era reflects the tower's chilling aura. In 1816, a guardsman on duty near the Jewel House swore that he saw a spectral bear emerge from the darkness and charge at him. Terrified, he thrust his bayonet at the creature, and when he did, it passed straight through and vanished. The guard was later found in a state of shock and died within a couple of days, reportedly from fright. Contemporaries speculated that perhaps the ghost of one of the tower's long-dead menagerie bears were haunting the site. Sounds pretty fanciful, but such tales found very eager ears. The tower's ghosts have been a persistent part of its lore. Anne Boleyn wandering around, headless, the 2 little princes gliding down a staircase hand in hand, the White Lady who waves from a window, and other phantoms seen by soldiers on lonely night watches. Now, whether you believe in that or not, the fact is the fact. And the fact is that these stories took root, and it shows how deeply the tower's bloody history had impressed itself upon the public mind. Well, despite all of that, the tower in the 1800s was generally peaceful. It served mainly as an armory, an archive, and of course a tourist attraction. However, it still had a garrison of troops, and at times of civil unrest it was put on alert. During the Chartist protest of 1848, agitating for political reform, the tower was prepared for potential trouble. But nothing came of it. By the late 19th century, the tower's days as a functioning prison were nearly over, but not quite. In 1885, a last jailbreak occurred. The Irish nationalist leader, Charles Parnell, was locked briefly in the Tower for contempt of Parliament, but only symbolically. He was likely held in pretty comfortable quarters and soon released, kind of like a house arrest situation. It seemed the Tower's awful chapters of incarceration were a thing of the past. However, the 20th century would prove that even in modern times, the Tower had a little bit more blood to spill. And so here we are in the 20th century, where the Tower enters its role as primarily a tourist attraction and historic monument. Yet remarkably, its long tradition as a prison and execution site did not end until World War II. Now, during World War I, 1914 to 18, the Tower was used to hold several German spies captured in Britain. At least 11 of these enemy agents were executed by firing squad at the Tower, a chilling throwback to older traditions. Not the axe this time, no. They were shot in the stone courtyard of the Tower, and their bodies buried on site. The first was Karl Hans Lodi in 1914, and others followed in the war's later years. Tour guides still point out the shooting post where these executions occurred. World War II brought one more flurry of grim activity. In 1941, a German spy named Joseph Jacobs was caught after parachuting into England. He was injured upon capture and taken to the Tower, and after a short trial for espionage, Jacobs was executed by firing squad on August 15, 1941, and he was the last person ever to be put to death at the Tower of London. He met his end seated in a chair because of his broken ankle, as the rifleman took aim. It was a pretty somber finale to the Tower's long, bloody record of executions. Now also, in 1941, the Tower briefly held perhaps its most high-profile prisoner in centuries, Rudolf Hess. That is the deputy of Adolf Hitler, who flew to Scotland on a quixotic peace mission. Hess was brought to London and confined in the Tower for a few days in May 1941. He thus became the Tower's final state prisoner. One can only imagine his thoughts, pacing in the same stone room where medieval kings and traitors had languished. But Hess was soon moved to a more conventional military prison, but the symbolic weight of the Tower's walls surrounding a top Nazi leader was not lost on observers. World War II also saw the Tower damaged by German bombing. In the Blitz of 1940, several buildings in the Tower complex suffered hits. The medieval chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where so many executed folk lay buried, had its roof blown off by a bomb. They fixed it up later. Still, never really the same. For the first time in centuries, the Tower's mighty walls shook from explosives rather than siege engines. During the worst air raids, the Tower was closed to the public, and the crown jewels were secretly moved to a safer location, probably out in the countryside somewhere. Now, most evocatively, the famous Tower ravens nearly all perished or flew away due to the bombing chaos. According to legend, if the ravens leave the Tower, the kingdom will fall. Ooh, that sounds like some kind of grim prophecy, doesn't it? Alarmed that only a single raven survived the Blitz, Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered that new ravens be brought in to repopulate the Tower, ensuring the legend and morale lived on. And to this day, at least 6 ravens are kept at the Tower at all times, well fed and trimmed of wing feathers to discourage any wanderlust on their behalf. After 1945, the Tower of London was officially retired as a prison. The days of old were finally over. Its last use in that capacity had been to hold a handful of British soldiers who went AWOL. Notably in 1952, one of the notorious Cray twins, that's Ronnie Cray, was held at the tower for a few days for failing to report for military service. But those were minor footnotes. The great era of prisoners and executions had ended. And in the post-war years, the tower began to embrace its identity as a monument to history. It became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and one of Britain's most visited tourist destinations. Each year, millions of visitors wander through those gates, marveling at the crown jewels in the glittering vault, peering into the eerie torture chamber in the White Tower basement, and standing on the Tower Green, where queens and nobles knelt before the axe. The yeoman warders, nicknamed beef-eaters, now serve mostly as tour guides, regaling visitors with tales of ghosts and gore, though they remain ceremonial guardians of the tower, of course. These warders still wear the splendid Tudor-style uniforms, adding to the sense that one has stepped back into a blood-stained past. Every night they perform the centuries-old ceremony of the keys, locking up the fortress for the evening in a ritual unchanged for hundreds of years. And thus the tower's story has come full circle. Once a feared fortress and prison, now a carefully preserved museum. But even in peace, the shadow of its horrible history lingers. In the courtyards you can almost sense the whispers of the prisoners long gone. And in the chapel, right below your feet, lie the bones of the executed. From Anne Boleyn to poor Lady Jane Grey. Ravens hop along the lawns, perhaps on watch for the ghosts of the headless queen. Who knows? Well, in any case, that is it for me tonight. I hope you enjoyed our video about the Tower of London. Certainly a quintessential medieval place, isn't it? Really is. And not just a medieval place, but also a Renaissance place, a Tudor place, a modern place, a Victorian place. Every era sort of has its own stories for the Tower of London, and I'm so glad that it's still there. In any case, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfinir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Reviews, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazarkin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pesty, Hun, Stevie, and Jessica. Thank you so, so much. And yes, that's our time done today, unless you want to go watch something else, I don't know. I hope you're having a good rest, or you just enjoyed the video anyway. I will say good night to you all, and lots of love to you all around the world. And see you when you feel like coming back. You know where I'll be. Farewell for now.